Well, I'm so honored to spend a little bit of time with you today, and I just want to welcome you to Next Steps at Eastside. I grew up in a small Midwest town. My parents decided early on in their marriage that they were going to keep their family small in order to give their kids a lot of opportunity, and so they stopped after number 6. And I was number 6. The truth is they stopped after baby number 5, and they got rid of all the baby paraphernalia, the crib, the high chair, etc. And then 5 years later, unexpectedly, they got a bonus baby. Some people call that the mistake. I always told mom and dad it was the unexpected blessing. But I'm one of those fortunate people who grew up in a home with a mom and a dad that really marked my life in positive ways. I know that's not everybody's story, and it may not be your story. For reasons I don't understand, sometimes people have very difficult upbringings. But I grew up in a home where I felt loved, and I'm actually a pastor's kid, and sometimes that can be a good thing, sometimes that could be a bad thing. In my case, it was a great thing because my dad was the same person at home that he was in public, and it was just a remarkable example for me. And I know this probably sounds weird to you, and a lot of kids grow up playing house or playing doctor, but we actually grew up at our house playing church. We would have little church services in our living room. I have 3 older sisters, and they would do like a worship team, and Brother Mike might say a prayer, and Brother Greg might do the communion, and then I'd give a sermon, and then we'd hit mom or dad 4 or 5 times with the offering plate before they realized what was happening. It was a very profitable experience for us growing up. You know, my dad as a pastor never made a great deal of money, but he did make sacrifices for our family in order to show us love. And one of the ways that he did that was he went together with 2 other financially challenged pastor friends, and back in the 1950s, they bought 2 beautiful lakefront lots on a lake in northern Minnesota for $250 a piece. Man, if you could buy property at that price today, wouldn't that be something? And it's actually at a location right near our Park Rapids, Minnesota campus. And they were so poor, these guys, that they really couldn't afford to build a home. And so they bought for $500 a cabin kit. And with their own hands, they built a cabin for their families to enjoy together. They were so poor, true story, they couldn't even afford a level. And to be honest with you, that old cabin looks like it was built by 3 pastors who couldn't afford a level. The only electricity we had was very primitive with some circuit breakers, and we couldn't run like an ironing board and an electric skillet without blowing one of the circuit breakers. The only water we had was if mom or dad yelled water, and one of us kids would run out back to the red pump, and we would hand pump the water and bring in the water in a bucket. And the only bathroom we had was an outhouse out back. I know many of you probably know what an outhouse is. And one of the things that I never understood about that outhouse was why it was a 2-seater, because no 2 people I know would ever want to go in there at the same time. But in spite of all of its structural imperfections, when I think of my greatest childhood memories, that's the place I think of. That it was on that lake that my dad taught me to fish, taught me to boat, to water ski, to swim, to canoe, just so many great memories there. Often at night, we would sit around the fireplace and play games, play cards. Sometimes we'd have family devotions together and pray together. I know it sounds like idealized, but that's just kind of how it was. When I was 14 years old, I'd been out fishing with my dad and my grandfather one day there at the lake in northern Minnesota, and came in that day and my dad wasn't feeling well. And later that night, he was so uncomfortable that it became necessary to take him to the little hospital there in Park Rapids. And it was then that we discovered he had a major heart attack. And over the next 4 days, his condition continued to worsen. And it became necessary to transport him by ambulance from that little hospital in Park Rapids, Minnesota, to the big hospital 90 miles away in Fargo, North Dakota. And so all the family went to Fargo to wait for the ambulance to arrive, except my brother Mike and I. We went back to the cabin where we were packing some things, and then we were going to go and meet and join the rest of the family in Fargo. And I'll never forget, while we were packing, I saw a familiar car drive up the road. It was my dad's best friend. And I'll never forget, he got out of the car and he put one arm around me just like this, and he put one arm around my brother Mike just like this. And he said, "Boys," he said, "I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for you." He said, "The good news is your daddy's gone to heaven today. And the bad news is he isn't with us any longer." And just like that, my life changed. And many of you, you've been through experiences in your life where just like that, everything changed. You got the phone call. You got the news of the heartbreak, the turning point. You know, I was 14 years old at that point, and I'd been a follower of Jesus for a number of years in my life. It was natural to put my faith in Jesus in the home that I grew up in, and having parents who pointed me to him and to his love and to his grace. But this was the first real challenge of my faith. This was the first crisis that I ever navigated in life. And I had some choices to make if I was going to trust God through that. Later that same day that my dad died, the family all regathered at the cabin, and we started packing to make the 700-mile drive back to where we lived in central Illinois for his funeral. And while we were packing and getting things ready, my mom asked me if I would go down the road. Just about a half mile away, there was a little resort that had a convenience store where over the summer we would buy milk and coffee and newspapers and things like that. And they would keep a tab. Can you imagine that? This was the old days. They would actually keep a tab and you could pay the bill at the end of the summer. And so Mom asked me if I would go down that road to the resort and pay off our bill. And I said, sure. So she gave me a wad of cash. And you know, I've not had a lot of experiences in my life where I felt like God just spoke to me. But I do feel like God spoke to me that day. And I remember everything about that walk in vivid detail. I remember the tall pine trees on each side of the road that lined the road. I even remember what I was wearing. I had on a maroon-colored T-shirt and plaid bell-bottoms with cuffs about that big at the bottom. I may have only been 14 years old, but I had a pretty good fashion sense about myself. But as I remember, as I walked down that road that day, it was as if God was speaking to me. And what I heard him say was, "Gene, you know what happened to your dad today is going to happen to every single person on the face of the earth. One day will be their last day on this planet. And there's only one thing ultimately that matters on that day. Do they have a relationship with me through my son, Jesus Christ? Have they experienced that amazing grace?" And fortunately, my dad did, and I know where he's at today. And I just sense God saying, "Gene, if you'll put your hand in my hand, if you'll trust me with your life, I'm going to use your life to help people get ready for their last day on this planet and to live every day between now and then in my power and grace." That day was the most defining day in my life. And if you wonder what makes Gene Apple tick, and if you wonder what I'm all about, and really kind of what's at the heartbeat of this church, it's to help people to get ready for their last day on this planet through a relationship with Jesus Christ and to live every day between now and then in his power and grace. And I can tell you, my decision to follow Jesus is the greatest decision that I've ever made in my life. And I've had ups and downs. I've had mountains and valleys. I went through a horrific, heartbreaking divorce back in the 80s. But all these years later, I can tell you that God has been faithful to me. And I am grateful for his call on my life to help people like you get ready for their last day on this planet.